everybody, Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the extraordinary honor and pleasure of chatting with none other than Todd Kerns. Yay!
How are you?
Outstanding, Todd. So great to have this chance to catch up. I know I've been planning to talk to you for quite some time now because we've been super busy doing all kinds of interviews, but the moment is here. Now we have this opportunity. As always, we like to go to the past. How did you get started in music, and particularly on bass?
I mean, I think like most people, it's sort of stumbled across whatever rock and roll, whether it was my parents' records and that kind of stuff. My father played guitar, my mother played piano, but they were not really religious about it. They just sort of, it was the kind of thing that just came out on occasion. And I would walk around the house. My dad had a harmony with the F-holes acoustic, and I'd walk around the house pretending to play it like pretending to be Elvis or something. I don't know. Mm-hmm. And my father one day was like, no. This is a C chord. This is a D chord. That's G, whatever the sort of like, and I was probably around 11, I think, by that point. And by that point, I think I'd already sort of found, my parents' Beatles records and Elvis. And then I really had the benefit of having all these relatives who were becoming grown-ups, and they were kind of like, oh, you can take all those. We'd go over to their place. I was obsessed with music at this point, and I'd go to my relative's house, and they would have either, I don't know, maybe replaced the music with, maybe vinyl was kind of going out, you know what I mean? And I think they were kind of like, oh, you can take all of that. And I'd be like, gold, take this whole big thing back. And I'd be like, Cream. I've never heard Cream before. Or the Guess Who and all these kind of, a lot of older music, because I was, by that point, in the 80s or maybe late 70s, I can't remember exactly. So I was finding all this music, and I think that I became obsessed with bands like The Who, and a lot of the sort of what I call the four major food groups of British rock, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, perhaps. Yeah. Obviously, eventually Led Zeppelin and bands like that. And then kids at my age finding Kiss and bands like that. It was really sort of the gateway drug to a much bigger, bigger world. So I started playing guitar a little bit, and my dad decided, okay, well, we bought an Epiphone acoustic. It's called an Epi, E-P-I, which I don't really see very often. I think they were very sort of, that might even been like an affordable model of an affordable model. I don't know. And I got around on that, and me and my friends would get together and make a terrible racket. And then my father's bizarre thinking was like, well, you got a guitar, we should get you a bass, which was the strangest. When I think back on it now, I go, well, why wouldn't he have gotten the electric guitar, and an amp or something? Yeah. Now you can do that. I've never regretted it, though, because at the time, it felt like no one wanted to play bass. Everybody wants to be a guitar player. Everybody wants to play the drums. Everybody wants to be a lead singer. And the bass player, especially back in those days, had always been thought of as a John Entwistle type, quiet, John Paul Jones, quiet, invisible dude in the corner. Mm-hmm. Although those two guys are hardly invisible musically if you really, actually know what you're listening to. So we went down to this shop and found a Gibson EB3. I actually don't even know what year that thing is. It's here. Yeah. I still have it. And it became one of those things that not only did I have a bass, I had a Gibson, which was a big deal because a lot of, everybody was buying, I don't know, whichever no-name affordable guitar they could get their hands on. But I don't know if my dad sort of found that this would have been in the 80s. So I think that this 70s Gibson may have been sort of not as desired, like maybe this is probably before it would have become like a vintage, interest. It would have just been like a bass from days past, basically. Guys would have moved on to whatever they were into at that point. So Steinbergers, who knows, But it did say Gibson on it, and that seemed to get some legs at high school. And I was so like into music, I would just sit there and tap on my desk, and I remember the guy in front of me turning around and going, "Are you a drummer or something?" And I go, "Oh, no, not really. I play guitar and I play bass." And he goes, "My brother's band's looking for a bass player." And I go, "Oh, and this is like a small town. Like I live in a small town of like 1,500 people. There's like no street lights, no anything."
Yeah.
So long story short, I ended up playing bass in this band, and that band became such a huge part of my life. We would play while my friends had jobs bagging groceries or whatever. My job was going out every Friday night after school, driving to some town to play a high school dance. Back then, they wanted live music for high school dances, and there were all these towns, all around this Canadian province that I grew up in. and we would just go from town to town. And often it'd be Friday, Saturday, and I'd come home on Sunday. And like I said, while my friends were bagging groceries, that's how I was making money. We actually made, about like $60 a weekend, or I don't know what it was, but I always had money in my pocket.
Yeah.
And then that band slowly went from being a 5-piece with a vocalist and another guitar player down to just a 3-piece, where I became the vocalist, which was just a process of elimination. You sing one. Okay, and now you sing one. Now you sing one. And then it kept coming back to me. Now you sing one. Now you sing. You sing one. You sing one.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, and then just by the process of elimination, I became the singer. And then once we were out of high school, we all sort of, hopped in a van and just sort of traveled around playing bars and becoming a traveling band, essentially. It remained like that until my brother and I put a band together, and he had picked up the bass while I was. He was my younger brother, and became, in a lot of ways, a much better bass player than me as far as like the technicality of it all. And so at that point, I became the singer and rhythm guitar player, and we put a band together. But so it's funny because there's a whole chapter of my life where I was a singer, songwriter, guitar player guy, and people didn't know me as a bass player. And then I came back around and came back around to the bass, and people would be like, it's weird seeing you play bass. But then I'll also have people go and say, it's weird seeing you play guitar. So it's kind of like, I go, well, McCartney was a guitar player until the necessity, became like, we need a bass player. And he went, well, okay, I guess I'm going to play bass, And he went on to be, a huge influence, in so many ways. I think it was interesting for me because it's always been, not just bass. It's always been vocals and all that as well. So that's a very long-winded answer, Raul. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. It's all good. Well, if I'm capturing this correctly, it sounds like you're pretty much self-taught for that.
Pretty much, yeah. Honestly, when I had my acoustic guitar as a kid, there was a bit of like, some local kid would come over and show you Michael Row the Boat Ashore or some other song you didn't want to learn. You're kind of like, okay, C, G, and you'd be like, but I want to play, you point at your record collection. It's different now. I'm so jealous of kids now who have School of Rock and they learn all these and they got better gear than I have now. How did you guys get this gear? And they're learning how to play, all the stuff that I wanted to learn when I was a kid. Yeah. But it was sort of, in a funny way, my parents were very encouraging about playing music, but I don't think they were encouraging about being in a rock and roll band. You know what I mean? Like that wasn't part of the equation that they had kind of counted on. That became sort of with that became like, sometimes I'd have to miss Friday at school because it's a longer drive to that gig on Friday. And sometimes I'd miss the Monday because, we worked out a party on the Sunday. And so school became very secondary to me. It became very sort of like I didn't care anymore. I had figured out exactly what I wanted to do at 15, 14 years old. And my parents were like, yeah, but that's, it's like saying, I'm going to put a cape on and fight crime. It's like, yeah. You're like, my parents were very sort of like, look, just finish high school. Just finish. 'Cause I was playing with guys who were much older than me on top of it all. So these guys were older than me, and they had sort of figured out a whole touring market of just kind of like a circuit of you could go around and play clubs and play. And they were ready. They were itching. But their singer, bass player, was, still in high school, and they're waiting for him to get it together, So finally, when I did, it was time to, it was like literally like diploma, boom, gone, I was like, and I was out the door, 17 years old, playing, traveling, living the dream, really. I was, broke and poor and sleeping in shady hotels and like, 5 guys in a room, But I don't remember ever kind of questioning it. Like and I think that that's sort of a big indicator of like a lot of guys along the way would be like, he's quitting and going to school, or he's quitting and because dad has a company or a business that he's going to go, And I'd be like, is he out of his mind? Like, it's like, this is the greatest thing in the world. Yes, we're making peanut butter sandwiches to survive every day or whatever, saving your money for a Happy Meal or whatever. But to me, it was like the greatest thing in the world. And I think I've always felt that way. It isn't until much, much later when you start to go, wait a second, I can't have a middle row seat on this airplane. Yeah. I'm 6'4". I need a But it's like when you're younger, you're just kind of like, isn't this great?
Yeah.
Yes, the bus broke down and it's freezing cold and we don't know how we're going to get to the next town. But it was just part of this big adventure of playing music that was, to me, just a dream.
Everybody's journey is so different, but the way your journey has gone also has put you in a very unique place because you frontman vocals as well, which so many bassists
Sometimes.
are more.
Yeah.
Well, but the fact that you're up at all, because there's a lot of bass players. I'm one. I can maybe pitch in on a chorus, but if it comes to like remembering the lyrics while my hands are going, I'm kind of like right brain, left brain. I just can't do both, one or the other. And it's very common, especially in no matter what genre you're looking at, where the bass player is more than happy just to kind of be tucked back in that little corner. They're coloring everything that's going on. As you mentioned, it's extraordinarily important, but they're not in the spotlight. They're leaving that usually to, some other, the guitarist. So, and the fact that you play multiple instruments and all of this has kind of built you up to being able to do what you do now. And one of those key things is you've been touring with Slash, featuring Mike Kennedy and the Conspirators.
Miles Kennedy, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in addition to that, many other bands. But a lot of times you are up there in the front, which is just, for me, again, mind-blowing. I couldn't do it even if I tried probably a lifetime to get to
I
that.
think it's also, growing up with, for every example of a quiet bass player, there's a Sting, there's a Geddy Lee, Paul McCartney, Gene Simmons, guys who were also singers who were playing. And Paul McCartney's sort of like the ground zero of this kind of, the Beatles were such an interesting thing, and a lot of people don't think about it, but Kiss is very much based on the same sort of model of having 4 different frontmen in a band or 4 different singers and 4 different personalities, where usually Mick Jagger or Mick Jagger, Keith Richards is sort of the focal point. You know what I mean? But I think that my focus was on that, as a bass player who could sing, because again, I when you say that, I was perfectly happy being in the band. Just, isn't this great? I'm in a band, all this stuff. And then when it became kind of like I said, it was never like me muscling my way to the front microphone. It was just sort of like, it just became sort of like, well, he can sing this or he can sing that. Bands like the Police became a huge touchstone for us because we were a 3-piece band back then, and the Police were, I think they probably may have already broken up or are on the verge of breaking up, but we just loved that whole thing. And I sort of couldn't help but look at guys like Sting, and I loved Geddy Lee and I loved Rush, but it was so much more advanced, still more advanced than I'm as a player. I was always sort of like knocked out and still continually knocked out. Because that's a guy, when you talk about right brain, left brain, and you're not wrong, because I literally find myself, we will record an album with Slash, and I sing all the harmonies. Like I sing all the backup harmonies and a lot of, on a few occasions during the show, 3 or 4 live lead vocals. But I will sing, we'll record the album musically, and then I'll do my vocals. And I don't think about it until I sit down to learn the album that, this is going to be hard to sing this and play this at the same time.
Yeah.
So you end up splitting your brain literally. And I learned a lot of this from guys like Geddy and Sting. To this day, I struggle with, there's a Police song where the bass line just makes no sense with what he's singing. And I've watched him do it live on multiple occasions, and I just go, damn, he is so much more advanced than me. I mean, he wrote the song too, so maybe it's just so much more in him.
Yeah.
But there literally is a thing where you literally go, this is the instrument I'm playing, the bass, this is the vocals. And it's sort of like you get to a point where you just muscle memory it and you rehearse it, that they become sort of independent of each other.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of, this thing here.
Exactly.
Where you're sort of doing something that doesn't really jive with the other thing.
Yeah.
Like Paul McCartney's a good example too. Like you watch him at 22 years old going, close your eyes and I'll miss. And it's just like, he's just walking all over the place.
Yeah.
Which he would have learned from the bass players he grew up on an upright like this. And so, because he grew up on rock and roll and he liked all those walking bass lines.
Yeah.
But he's doing it singing perfectly in key with a big smile on his face, and he's 22, and you're like, oh, dude.
Yeah.
It's so intimidating. But there was a part of me that was just kind of like, well, I guess this is just what we do. You know, we just learn to play. And I was never like the kind of guy who was too cool to play an AC/DC bass line that's just sort of a root note kind of hanging there kind of thing. So, but on some occasions, sometimes the bass did lend itself to be able to be, when it is more of a root note kind of bass line.
Exactly.
To be able to sing and do that wasn't as challenging as having a very prominent bass line. Because I know a million guitar players too who don't sing backups, and I go, how can you not at least go up there and go, hey, you know, or whatever the generic line is, because you're so musical. I can't believe that you can't find that in your voice just to be able to kind of know to sing the major third of that or the fifth or whatever. Yeah. You know, like I said, I've been immersed in it since I was 12, 14 years old. That it's super normal to me that whether it's the bass or I've always been sort of somewhat more limited as a guitar player because I was never interested in being Edward or Steve Vai or Randy Rhoads. I was always kind of like, I always thought I like playing guitar and I like being able to play songs, and that kind of felt like enough to me. Guys like Rick Nielsen, who played, you know, Pete Townsend, those kind of guys. I always kind of, Keith Richards, I always kind of lean more towards those guys. That's just my personal taste in guitar playing. But playing bass is such a different animal because, you know, and to get really sort of esoteric about it, I've always found the bass to be the most sort of communal instrument in a way, because the drummer is doing his thing. The drummer is he's sort of steering the ship. You know? And we all just, wherever he's going, we're going, you know. So, but I have to lock with him. I have to lock with the drummer. That is a given. The bass and the drums are sort of meshed together. But that said, I'm very much playing with the guitar player or guitar players because I'm playing notes. I'm playing.
You got melody
and things like that, and those have to jive.
Yeah.
And then I'm a vocalist, so I'm playing whether I'm singing the song or I'm playing with a guy like Miles. I'm thinking as a vocalist as well. So I find myself sitting there like, you know, like just got one eye on him, you know. Another eye on him. Somehow I've got a third eye on, you know, there's just all this sort of like, and guitar players, you know, the drummer does his thing, and I find that guitar players sometimes just do their own thing, you know, and you just sort of, they play on top, and they kind of, not all of them, obviously, that there's different versions of players, but I think as a bass player, I find anyway, that it's sort of like, I'm there to kind of like play with everybody. Yeah. You know, and bring it together and sort of gel it together. I would imagine that's probably the similar job that, say, John Paul Jones probably thought of, or whatever else. It's a very interesting place to be, and I'm sure you know that too.
Indeed. Well, and as we're talking so much about bass playing, we should talk a little bit about how you're getting your sound. I was watching some of your videos, seeing some Thunderbirdish basses. Tell us a little bit what gear you're playing on.
I'm 6'4", almost 6'5", so I've always leaned. As a kid, I loved the Gibson Les Paul Jr. That was the coolest guitar, Johnny Thunders and all those guys. And I would see photos of myself playing them, and I thought, it looks like a ukulele on me. It looks so dorky. You'll see Angus Young with that SG, and it just, you know, he's such a small, diminutive individual that the SG just looks so much more like an ES335 on him or something like that. Yeah. So I would play these guitars, and they would look so small on me that I kind of. So bass made more sense in a lot of ways. But even sometimes I'll look at a P bass, which looks more congruent with my size. But I always sort of lean towards these larger. If you look at the original Thunderbirds, they've changed them now. I wish I had one on hand because I love pointing these kind of things out. But they have the more triangular tuning pegs on them now. Back in the day, they had the clovers, like you see on a P bass. So the headstock on a Thunderbird was even longer with the clovers because it just made more room for the tuning pegs. So it makes the bass just enormous. And guys like Tom Peterson from Cheap Trick and a few other guys like me are sort of obsessed with Thunderbirds and the way they've changed over the years. The non-reverse that they introduced last year. So they originally came as a non-reverse. I've got one of the guitars over there, but you can't see it.
Yeah.
A non-reverse Firebird or a non-reverse Thunderbird.
Yeah.
They eventually flipped them, and they became popular. They were not that popular as a non-reverse, but they reintroduced them last year or maybe the year before. I can't remember exactly, but I started playing them, and they were really fun. So I do a signature model out of Vancouver. My friends have a company called Prestige, and it's sort of Thunderbird-ish. I would hate to think it's in any way sort of, it's certainly an homage or a nod. In fact, it's sort of like a half non-reverse and a half reverse with a reverse headstock. I've always loved reverse headstocks on my guitars and my basses. There's just something about the way Richard Fortus from Guns N' Roses he'll go on a complete rabbit hole with you about why the E string should be that long, and you're kind of, okay, I just like the way I just think it looks cool, and I like the way it feels. But I started doing this signature model with my friends out of Vancouver, this awesome company. And Guns N' Roses got back together in 2016. So just when I was sitting down to do this model, it was decided, okay, well, let's focus on the 6-string version, the guitar. The Anti-Star 6 is what it's called. And we introduced it at NAMM 2017. And we got a platinum award through Guitar World magazine, which was a huge deal to me. It's like, while my friends were looking at cars and looking at everything else, I was like obsessed with guitar magazines. I'm just like, I had to have every one, or if I couldn't afford it, I would just sit in the store and just look at it. and the ads were as awesome as the articles. It's like finding an ad of whichever guitar company, and usually the more radical, the better. I've always sort of leaned more towards Billy Gibbons or Rick Nielsen in their taste of the radical guitars, So being able to kind of have a guitar that not only was introduced at something like NAMM, which is a big deal, but to have it be recognized as being of such high quality was a big deal. It's like, my wife had the article printed out and put on the wall. It's a big thing.
Nice.
So the bass wasn't even introduced until 2018, I guess. We finally did a Slash run. And they've been around ever since. It's an interesting model because I have played in the passive world, I've played in the active world, and find benefits to both. I'm one of those guys that's sort of like, but I would go back to the sort of 70s recordings. When we would do our records, I found myself just sort of really going back to P basses and Thunderbirds and things that had existed since 1960 whatever, or 50 whatever, you know what I mean? And I would think to myself, it's so interesting that, with all the innovations that are out there, I find myself so attracted to this world. And then we would build these, when we would record the bass, we would do very unbass things for amps. We would have often an SVT, Ampeg SVT, which is the obvious thing, that you should have as a starting point. Obviously, there's other versions of, I use GK Live, I always have. They've been very good to me. But in a recording situation, I find it's always vintage gear. We always have some beat to hell SVT that just has the mojo. Yeah. But then we're using, then we're like powering it into often an orange guitar amp or a Marshall 412 and mixing these tones together into this monolithic, monstrous sound. But I would go like, it's so crazy, isn't it? But then you'd look back at like John Entwistle or Noel Redding, and a lot of those guys were playing 412 Marshall amplifiers because the idea of a bass amp
didn't exist.
Didn't exist. It was sort of like you just needed something to amplify your instrument as loud as possible. So guys like Entwistle, who was very attracted to a very over-the-top tone, which is sort of kind of in the world that I live. We became very good friends with Lemmy from Motorhead, and he loved, his tone was nuts. It was like, and he would show up, he would come to jam with us, and it would literally be his Marshall amp head, and they eventually made him larger, I think 215, maybe 415. I think there were 415 Marshall stacks, and it was like, but he was always playing through guitar amps. He just preferred that tone. But what I found later on, what Slash and I both commented on later on, was the later records, they started to kind of sneak in, often much to Lemmy's chagrin, a bottom end, a SVT or whatever they found, and would create that undertone that was basically missing from Motorhead's sound, which you could call it missing. That was his tone. That's the sound of the band. And you go, okay, cool. But Entwistle had that too, where he wanted it to be just piercing, like you're not going to miss this guy. Even though he's the bass player quietly standing over there, he's the most overwhelming sound of the entire show.
Yeah.
So I've always found myself sort of very attracted to what will happen with passive humbucker style pickups in a Thunderbird style bass through getting that nice warm tone and that just classic bass tone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then sneaking in those secret frequencies that are just not present in a bass context. Guys like Tom Peterson from Cheap Trick is a whole other conversation because he plays like a 12-string bass.
Yeah.
But he has, like, when you look at his rig, this is the low end, that is the high end. And he's doing it in a very sort of vintage way. Like his amps are old school. Like he's sort of dialed in his tone in 1970 whatever.
And stayed there.
Yeah, and that's where it is. And he probably could, in a modern sense, use a Kemper and model that and just sort of go, click, there it is.
Yeah.
But I think some of those old school guys, they're never going to change that. And I've sort of played in that world as well. What I find now in a live setting is that my GKs act as, in a similar way, I'm playing the same game of this is my bass tone, and then I'll get like a Sans amp. And I love the overdrive on the Sans amp can be it's probably a little more overdriven than most people would use it, but my intention is for it to be blended together out front to be able to find its sort of the warmth, but also the, it still cuts, you know what I mean? And that's kind of where I live. I've always been a pick player. I never really, my brother played with his fingers. He was like really great with his fingers. He loved Entwistle. He loved Steve Harris from Iron Maiden,
Yeah.
And I was always sort of like, I was very into punk rock. I grew up on Paul McCartney. I grew up on Tom Peterson. And all those guys were my guys. Dee Dee Ramone, it's like punk rock was, it was as much a part of the sound as the driving, often down picking type thing. And I never really thought of it until people would, I remember playing in clubs and this guy coming up to me and going, how long have you been playing bass? And I go, I don't know, 5 years or however long I've been playing.
Yeah.
I was a kid, and he goes like, you're still playing with the pick, huh? And I remember going like, that's a choice. It's not like I'm going to graduate to my fingers, it's sort of because there's a lot of guys who play with picks and a lot of guys who play with fingers, and I love them both. It's just sort of AC/DC. There's a number of different tones and sounds of how guys play, and then there's those other guys. Entwistle, his whole thing was his fingers, and those guys. So, but I just sort of lived in that other world, and I guess because Paul was my guy, I just sort of like, this is how you do it. This is how you play, and this is how you interface.
As I'm sure you've noticed in the bass community, there are there's a few areas
There's very strong opinions about.
Exactly. I was going to refer to them as open festering sores. Whether it's you play with a pick or you don't play with a pick. It's whether you have 4 strings or more, because that's a whole other thing.
It is, yes.
There's a lot of drawing lines in the sand, and you should do this and you shouldn't do that.
And I'm actually one of those guys that I've always been fascinated with, like, I got a ukulele, I needed to know how to play that. I got a mandolin, I needed to know how to play, because it's so different than what we've kind of come up on. So when you introduce things like 5-string basses, I'm fascinated by it. It's not my jam. Like, I don't really kind of want to go there in a way. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, but I've always been very like open G tuning on guitars. I'm very comfortable in that.
Yeah.
And if I'm on stage and suddenly somebody goes, we're going to play this song in F, and I go, okay.
Yeah.
I've always been sort of quick with knowing where I am on the instrument. So when you add that B string, I was always very quick to adjust to it. Like, okay.
Yeah.
But I just found in the world that I live in, with Slash and the kind of rock and roll.
Yeah.
I just felt like the last album we did, I usually tamper with a drop D, or usually often C sharp because we're a half step down.
Mm-hmm.
So I usually find some, world to kind of add those extra kind of dimensions to the tone. But the last album we just did was all half step down, but all one tuning. And I was kind of fascinated by the idea of like, I always got my eyes open and my ears open to kind of know like this song should have this or this song should have like, I should be doing, maybe a slightly lower thing or whatever here. But the album just felt like an AC/DC record where it's kind of like, AC/DC does sort of the same thing for the past 40 years. Yet somehow it remains fresh and we all love it. And we would be almost kind of, why is that guy playing a low B on playing a 5-string bass in AC/DC? It would be just so strange,
Yeah.
But and then in my project Heroes and Monsters, we did such a purposely different thing where I am playing a 4-string bass, but I'm playing B, E, A, D.
Yes.
So I'm using the low 4 from the 5-string. I could have very easily just gotten a 5-string, but I didn't. When I really sort of did the deep dive in what I had recorded on the record, I just felt like I don't need that. I don't really need. I own 5 strings and I enjoy using them on lots of sessions and stuff like that. But it's just not for me.
Yeah.
And so guitar pick and a 4-string bass, I don't feel like I'm a yellow belt and the other guy's like a ninth degree black belt. If he feels that way, that's kind of like, that's cool. I like playing music. I don't really sort of sweat, what it is we're doing or what we're not doing.
Yeah.
I suppose if I was hired by Linkin Park or some band like that, which I don't know why they would hire me because there's other guys that are more qualified for that kind of music, I would just adjust my world to work in the context of what that is because they work in a different tuning and a different kind of world. And I've used my fingers on tons of different gigs and tons of different sessions because they called for it. But when I really am honest with myself and look in the mirror, I go, yeah, I play with a pick and I play a 4-string bass. On a Thunderbird, which isn't really the most popular choice of basses either. A lot of people are like, it's like a fucking coffee table.
Well, the fact that they're using mahogany and the fact that it's got a serious amount of wood going on there, indeed. And the other part I think that's crucial is the kind of music you're looking at. And there, for example, if you talk to the guys that are playing the Broadway pits, most of those are written for 5-string. Absolutely. And even with an upright, they have to add the extension for low C. Yeah. So, it's if it's called for, you go with what you need to do to do the job.
Trust me, I watch talk shows, SNL or whatever, and I'll watch the band playing, and I'll see them turn a sheet of music, and I immediately go, well, I'm not qualified. I'm not qualified for that gig.
Yeah.
Because I don't read music. I never learned to read music because I didn't come up in that. I call myself a street fighter. Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't fight at all, but I learned to fight on the street. I didn't learn in a dojo, and I mean that musically. I never learned, all that stuff. It's sort of like I learned by being on stage in terrible sounding clubs with not being able to hear yourself. But I was always, looking at the Beatles, like I say, they couldn't hear anything. It was just gah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you watch that footage and they're singing perfectly in tune together because it's all muscle memory. They're just that talented. They're just naturally talented. And I just sort of made myself kind of get good enough to play with guys who were so much more qualified than I am. There's a line, but I don't think that I am interested in crossing that line into I'm not qualified to play in a Broadway pit, but that's not really a goal of mine.
Exactly.
Like, I don't think, why would I don't know that that's a gig I want, and I don't know why anybody would even consider me for it.
Yeah.
I'd be like, that guy? No. He's a loud rock and roll bass player that plays in noisy places, and that's what he should do. And I agree.
It's your journey. So, and speaking of journey, we should talk. What's in the works for the future? What are the plans coming up?
Well, things get busy again. While I'm in Vegas, I play on a show called Raiding the Rock Vault, which you should come to. We should talk about that.
Yeah,
it's a classic rock show, and guys from Dio, and guys from Heart, and guys from Slaughter. All my friends that play in bands that have been around for a long time and done all kinds of cool stuff, and we just have fun doing it. So whenever I'm home, I'm doing that. Next month, I'm doing it's a tattoo convention, but myself, Brent Fitz from Slash's band playing drums, Brent Woods from Sebastian Bach's band's playing guitar, and we're doing a show where Phil Lewis from LA Guns, Tammy Down from Faster Pussycat, and Sebastian Bach, originally from Skid Row, those guys are all coming out and singing, and we're the backing band. So it's a fun thing. And then in October, I do a KISS convention, a KISS show with Ace Frehley and Bruce Kulick, and I'm playing Lick It Up in its entirety and Kiss Alive 3 in its entirety. And I got kind of in this world with Bruce Kulick, who was in the non-makeup version of KISS. The first time I saw KISS, Bruce was the guitar player, so I have a deep attachment to that world. So I started playing with Bruce, and we started doing the KISS cruise and all these kinds of things. And that has turned into a whole other world of like being able to play in these KISS things. Is so much fun. And then in November, Took, my band, the Canadian band, is doing a run of dates through Canada. It's always like, let's go to Canada. When's the coldest time to go tour? Let's go then.
In November.
In November, yeah. I'm like, okay. But it's, where I come from. I grew up in the Midwest, in the prairies, we call it in Canada. And it's always great to go back there. And I've been playing with, we started it as kind of like a charity group, raising money for benefits and playing. We just sort of said, let's just play nothing but Canadian music, because that'd be an interesting, fun challenge. April Wine, Loverboy, the list goes on. And that band we started writing songs. We started, as musicians do. The guitar player plays with Shania Twain. Fitz plays with me and Slash's band. And it turned into something else. And we do that on occasion. I immediately go from Canada back home for a day and then back to Europe with Heroes and Monsters, the project I have with Will Hunt from Evanescence and Steph Burns from Alice Cooper and a bunch of stuff. And that'll take me into December. I've got a couple of solo shows in here. I do solo shows around Vegas here and stuff like that too. Nice. So there's a bunch of that going on. And then we go into rehearsals with Slash. And so I'm like busy until April of 2024, of which people are coming at me and going like, well, dates are starting to pop up in summer 2024. And I'm kind of like, oh my God, we're talking about 2024 already. I'm like, and summer of 2024, I'm like, slow down. I want to try and enjoy, all of this, because the next thing I know, it's summer 2025. And I'm like, where's the time going? It's going too fast. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, and if people want to stay on top of what you're doing, because obviously you've got so many balls in the air juggling here, if they go to toddkerns.com, is that the best place?
Yeah, that's really the main place to go. I'm on Instagram, Todd Kerns. I'm on Twitter, Todd Kerns, I think I'm on there. And Facebook, all that kind of stuff. I'm pretty easy to find, and I'm pretty visible and pretty active. So if there's anything going on and you follow any of those things, you'll be inundated and annoyed with how much information is coming at you.
You're busy. Well, Todd, we appreciate you taking time to chat with us, share your journey and all this exciting news and things that are going on. Folks, you've seen him here on Bass Musician Magazine, Todd Kerns.
Thank you so much. This is a blast.